Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. This is the second of three essays dealing with the Russian-German War of the 1940s in the Second World War. The purpose of this, the second of the three essays, is to look at the decision to invade the Soviet Union. Was that reasonable at the time based on the information that Hitler and the Wehrmacht planners, Wehrmacht meaning the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht planners had in front of them at the time, or was it a huge strategic blunder? Was it a huge mistake? Was that mistake obvious? Was it just crazy madman Hitler making dumb decisions and drunk on the overconfidence of the victories in Poland and France and Norway and so on? So let's have a look at that. Now, to do this very interesting question justice, we need to examine quite a few of the issues, the facts, the realities, the military intelligence, the informed assumptions that went into this decision to launch this invasion of the Soviet Union, and let's just see how that pans out. Now, Hitler believed in, indeed the planners around him and the military brass believed in pre-June 1941. So June 22nd, 1941 is when the invasion of the Soviet Union was launched. So in pre-June 1941, and even that, leading up to the final days before the attack and doing the final logistical planning and so on, the armed forces would win a quick and decisive series of victories, which would place low or minimal strain on the German economy. Bear in mind, the German economy is running almost at peacetime levels, just slightly below peacetime levels. So, consumer goods like cameras and, women's cosmetics are all being still manufactured. And there are restrictions on things like petrol or petroleum, but really not a whole lot else. And the factors, all the factors in the planning, whether you see it was optimistic or not, the quick victories with low casualties and low strain in the economy could be achieved. They were they weren't unreasonable assumptions, given the success of Blitzkrieg again in France and Poland and elsewhere. Now, as battlefield sort of events unfolded, the planning was well within the bounds of reality and represented good quality planning. The front line and all the frontier forces, including some of the border reinforcements that were piling in, sort of 3.2 million Soviet troops were annihilated, as in killed or captured, by the Wehrmacht for losses in killed and wounded of less than 230,000. And some of the numbers there of Wehrmacht casualties in that opening sort of frontier battles had the Wehrmacht casualties at less than 200,000, and this includes wounded, by the way. And the Wehrmacht encouraged people who had relatively minor wounds to go straight to get medical attention, and the view that because they were a highly trained asset, as most of the Wehrmacht soldiers were, it was better to take them out of the front line with a minor injury, get that injury attended to, and then they could go back into the front line as fully operational assets, rather than leave an injured soldier there who may then get further injury or die or whatever. So the amount of dead, depending on whose numbers you look at, this is after 3.2 million Soviet troops have been annihilated. The amount of Wehrmacht dead were supposedly in the region of about 50,000. But however you look at it, the ratio of Soviet troop deaths, again killed or captured here, and many millions have been captured, or hundreds of thousands have been captured. There's a ratio of anywhere between 12 to 15 to 1. So this is the ratio of casualties. So when we come back to this idea of that the Wehrmacht can achieve quick victories while sustaining very minimal casualties, and that was really around the core of their planning. This is true. It was realistic. It wasn't in the realms of insane fantasy. Far from it. It was realistic and was proved to be so in those first weeks of the battle being joined. Now again, the German economy being at near peacetime levels, the this wasn't just because the amount of war material that was put aside for the blitzkrieg. If you're going to win the battles and the war quickly, then you don't need to have a war economy, was the rationale at the time, which again wasn't unreasonable. Now, some war material production was being distributed around, like, for example, French manufacturing of trucks was so rather than being made in Germany, German factories, they were being made in France, in the French factories, in fact, French trucks. And, say, light tanks were being made in the Czech Republic, as an example. So, particularly with quite advanced pneumatics. Very advanced pneumatics were actually a time in those Czech tanks, although they suffered in the cold weather in Russia later in the war. Now, it was only with great reluctance that Hitler wanted to move to a wartime economy, even when it became, in the years to come, absolutely necessary. Now, by contrast, the Britain and the Soviet Union went to war economy straight away. They hit the panic button and went into a full-time war economy from day one. And this, particularly in the case of the Soviets, that this meant they could be out producing the German war machine in terms of war material quite substantially. Of course, they weren't producing consumer goods. They were at an absolute bare bones minimum for consumer goods. But in terms of war material production, it only took them 12 months before they were outstripping the German economy in war material production. There are a number of unresolved strategic tactical issues, because they sort of combine both, I guess, and we should revisit some of those just to give a wider context to what was going on. Was it a strategic blunder not to fully neutralise Britain following the stunning military victory in France in 1940? Some claim that it was a mistake and turned into, as events played out, turned into a strategic blunder over time, as that was the launching pad, of course, for the D-Day invasion. Britain, that is, was the launching pad for the D-Day invasion. But at the time in 1940, following the July, the Britain's boots on the ground military capability in terms of being a threat to German-occupied Europe was minuscule. The British Navy was quite formidable, but they were limited in what they could do outside of the coastal defence of Britain, and they relied very heavily on air cover that they didn't have enough of. So the British Navy was very limited in its capacity to operate outside of that immediate theatre. The Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force, the British had hung on for a draw, but if the Luftwaffe had kept up the pressure, then the Royal Air Force would have cracked and would have folded, and it would be interesting to sort of surmise what might have happened there. Anyway, as Wehrmacht planners considered it, Britain could be dealt with later. It was going to what could be achieved by invading Britain was viewed as being minimal in reality, and so why go through that aggravation for what was perceived as being really a minimal sort of return? The bigger prize would be the defeat of the Soviet Union, and then Britain would be forced to come to terms with the German government. Now, Hitler was interesting. He was filled with admiration about Britain and the Empire and what they'd achieved, and thought it was really a very substantial, indication of sort of Anglo-Saxon type society and what it could achieve. And Hitler, remember, was a working class guy, lower middle class, working class guy, and he wanted to be revered as a great leader. And what sort of better way to do that is to being paid homage by the British aristocracy and British leadership. So Hitler was offering very generous terms to Britain at the early stage, and I believe that was genuine. It was more important to Hitler to be revered by the British than it was to humble or humiliate them. So interesting sort of aside there. Now also we need to look at should the need to invade modern-day Serbia and Croatia and Yugoslavia at the time and Greece be factored into the overall invasion equation, or treated as it was on the day as an irritation but not to be given much weight. The Yugoslav government had signed a favourable treaty with the German government, but then they reneged on that and were making sort of threatening and bellicose noises. The British were very influential in Greece, so the German government decided to invade Yugoslavia, or again modern day Serbia, Croatia, and neutralise them. Now, it was a quick campaign. It didn't take very long, but it did delay the invasion of the Soviet Union, and there was a narrow window that the Wehrmacht had. They really had to wrap up the invasion by really early October. That was sort of the latest that they could really run. So they would have begun maybe a couple of weeks earlier, because the weather wasn't very good there for a bit of time. So they probably would have started somewhere between June 7th and 10th. In the overall scheme of things, the invasion would have started had it not been for that distraction going down to Greece and so on. So, and had the Yugoslav government not reneged, there was a change of government in effect, and they reneged. Had that not happened and the invasion started earlier, certainly if you look at the timeline, it's I'm pretty convinced that the Wehrmacht would have provided. I think they would have been setting up shop in Moscow in early October without much doubt. Nonetheless, that's not how it played out. But at the time, the delay caused by going down into Yugoslavia and Greece was again seen as more of an irritation than something that was going to be going to deeply affect the outcome of the battles. But as we look back at it now, that 2 weeks, give or take, that 2 weeks of lost time did turn out to be critical. So we can see it in more strategic terms, again, with hindsight. Some other considerations in the wider scheme of things was Hitler indulged Mussolini in his lust for territorial aggrandisement, and the Italian invasion of British Egypt was a complete fiasco. And so to rescue Mussolini, Hitler dispatched General Rommel's Africa Corps to North Africa to help bail out the Italians there. Now, this force was really just a little bit too small to defeat the British in Egypt, but it did draw away resources from the main battles being played out in the Soviet Union. Now, the Africa Corps came fairly close, actually, to defeating the British in North Africa, and caused great anxiety in London, but in the end, it was a distraction. If a more formidable German force had been put in Africa, they could have easily defeated the British and captured Egypt and the Suez Canal, which could have been war-winning in a number of ways. And it was a vital sea lane for Britain going through the Suez Canal to India and that sort of thing. So if we look for strategic blunders, the involvement, the distraction of going to Africa, Hitler could have put enough, he had the capacity to put enough force there to easily win that, but instead didn't just put enough force in to keep the battles alive rather than be decisive, but took away 2 or 3 divisions from what could have been used in the Soviet Union, and those 2 or 3 divisions many believe would have been decisive in winning the war in the Soviet Union. So that few divisions seems like irrelevant, but in the overall scheme of things, it actually was. I mean, the Wehrmacht was just a smidgen short of the resources needed to win quickly in the Soviet Union. Just a couple of divisions more, it would have nailed it. So that's how close it was. A very close run thing, and therefore moving those divisions to Africa really, and not getting a decision there was a strategic blunder one can see with hindsight. Now, Hitler had every reason to believe that because of the campaigns in Poland and France and so on, that the campaign in the Soviet Union would be successful and would be dealt with quickly. And you also need to remember the military strategists around at the time, in America and Britain and elsewhere, they viewed that the Wehrmacht would win. I mean, some of the American military strategists were saying they thought the Wehrmacht would win in 6 weeks. It was seen as their army was considered to be, again, the gold standard, and the Soviet Red Army was considered to be very substandard. Therefore, the Wehrmacht would win very quickly, and there wasn't there wasn't really any sort of dispute around that. It was pretty much unanimous, and obviously so. Even if you put aside the obvious meticulous capabilities of the Wehrmacht and their planners and logistics experts, the Soviet armed forces had shown rank incompetence in the invasion of Finland the year before. They'd suffered very heavy losses and had taken a long time to get their logistical machine, their field maintenance of equipment was so bad that hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were dying without achieving military success. One thing that came out of this, a lot of people miss, is how prepared the Soviet government was to take any amount of losses of men and material, to take any amount of losses in order to achieve victory or to pursue their ideological aims. And this was something that was missed and something we saw come up again in spite of horrendous losses on an unimaginable scale. Stalin and the Soviet government was still prepared to, quite unswervingly, to pursue the war in the face of all these. Something in the order of 20 million Soviet citizens died and soldiers and so on died in the conflict. But this was, who cares? And only an ideological government will take that view. So the invasion of Finland, and of course even the invasion of Poland with overwhelming force, the Soviet invasion of Poland was also a fiasco. And on top of that, Stalin in the preceding few years had purged, that is, taken it back and purged the army of its most competent and capable officers. Even colonels and lieutenant colonels were being murdered by a paranoid Stalin. So that most of the competent officers were gone. There was a few over because the Japanese and the Soviets had some battles over in the Far East around what today is Manchuria and so on, and some of the officers there had performed well. They were left, like Zhukov and so on. They weren't murdered, but the others, there was Tukhachevsky and so on. Were murdered for nothing more than paranoia and ideology. So the Soviet armed forces were ranked well below that of Britain and France in capability terms, and Britain and France has been handily beaten by the Wehrmacht. So the idea of a quick victory over the Soviet armed forces was reasonably expected. Nobody was really disputing it either. Now the confidence, or such was the confidence rather, of the Wehrmacht military planners, and we're talking guys like, say, the early planners who'd looked at the issue of invading the Soviet Union, such as General Marx, for example. That's spelled M-A-R-C-K-S, by the way, not with an X. Figured that 16 to 18 weeks was the timetable for the invasion all to be wrapped up and concluded. Marx was more concerned, as he saw it, about capturing Moscow and the central rail hub, which was something of an obsession with German planners, and simply holding forces on the flanks to just prevent any flank attacks, but really putting all the emphasis on the centre line and going to Moscow. Now, very similar to actually how Napoleon had envisaged it, 100 plus years before. Now, you can't write the German planners off as amateurs. I mean, they were the best in the world, and so. When they put plans like this together and put timelines on it, it's got to be reasonable given what they know at the time. There was a lot of allegations that Hitler was constantly interfering, and not that he didn't have his point of view. I mean, he's the head of state, and he had to sign off on all the budgets and things like that. So he wanted to know what was going on, and he did say that the just a straight drive, all or nothing drive for Moscow was high risk. And he was, which was again supported by numerous other planners and logistics experts in the Wehrmacht high command. So in the end, they decided to disperse the striking force, if you like, into three directions: going to St. Petersburg, Leningrad up in north there on the Baltic Sea, Moscow in the centre, and then going down the south to Kiev and into Rostov and the Caucasus Mountains, where the oil was that was obviously important to Hitler and to the German war machine generally. So 16 to 18 weeks was really, no matter how you looked at it, that they pretty much all accepted that timetable, and Hitler's interference, to whatever extent it was really cautionary rather than overconfidence or radical or amateurism. Now you can have a look at the lower level tactical errors, and they're worth looking at as well, because they, in the overall scheme of things, they did play out to be relevant. Some very relevant. Now, the idea that the Red Army would, the Soviet armed forces would defend the frontier with everything they had was about right. And so it was assumed that given everything that they had, the Soviets had, if you could destroy that near the frontier or close to it, then you could. It was presumed that that would kind of be the end of effective resistance, and then you could either the regime, the Soviet regime, would have collapsed politically at that point, or there would be no effective opposition, and you could kind of just go in and take Moscow and complete the occupation invasion at your leisure in what would be a relative walkover, or so it was presumed. Now, the Soviet political collapse, that was assumed as a very strong likelihood, not necessarily inevitable, but certainly a strong likelihood. And again, this was a reasonable assumption. The many Soviet defectors and so on, and the international intelligence services all around the world believed the discrediting of the Soviet government by heavy military defeats would lead to, or probably lead to, political collapse. Similarly, most of the Soviet republics who'd been brought into the Soviet Union, the greater Soviet Union, brought in by brute force and threat of invasion or killing off their political leaders and so on. These people weren't necessarily invested in or very keen on being part of it. They were very keen to get rid of Soviet control. This includes Belarus, Ukraine, where of course we see military conflict today, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on, Estonia. Finland was being pushed around by the Soviets. They were keen to break free. Some of the republics down in the the Caucasus Mountains, where all the oil was, they were keen to get rid of the Soviets. So there was very much an air of revolution, wanting to throw off the Soviet yoke. Now, the Russians didn't quite see it in the same way, and as the but many did. Over 500,000 Soviet soldiers, Red Army soldiers, effectively defected to the Germans during the course of the war. So this there was what was underestimated was the extent of the surveillance state and the secret police, and the willingness of the secret police not only to kill people that they thought were maybe not wholly on board with things, but also to threaten, or we'll kill your relatives if you don't do what we want. And this state of terror was such that the Soviets were able to say, well, you can either go into battle and fight the enemy, or we'll kill you. Either way, you fight the battle, you've got a chance of living. But if you don't, we will kill you. And the terror that they had to employ, which was something the Nazis would never have dreamed of, the terror they employed was something that was underestimated. And similarly were its effects. Now, it's difficult to fault any of the Wehrmacht planning decisions. We can quibble with some of the lower level tactical decisions, and they're worth looking at. For example, should Panzer IIIs be upgunned to a 50mm medium velocity or high velocity cannon with armour piercing shells? Now, this is something that Hitler wanted. He'd heard rumours about the T-34 and thought, well, none of the current cannons, or even the anti-tank brigades, by the way, none of the current cannons on the tanks, main guns, would be enough to knock out a heavier armoured tank. So Hitler thought it was prudent to put a medium velocity or high velocity cannon on the Panzer IIIs, which could have been done without much drama, with the armour piercing shells and so on. But the army argued back, saying, well, the logistics, different manufacturing requirements, different storage for weapons, and just the sheer logistics of it all made it difficult and cumbersome. And it wasn't needed. It was only rumour about the T-34 heavily armoured Soviet tanks. So we're not going to need it, and we'll win quickly anyway, and so on. So Hitler let it go, and as it turned out, that if the Panzer IIIs had been, or most of them, or all of them, upgunned to the 50mm medium velocity, then all of those tanks could have knocked out a T-34 or any of the Soviet heavy armoured tanks could have knocked out a Soviet tank without any trouble. As it panned out, when the T-34 started to appear in the T-34 Soviet tank, heavily armoured tanks started to appear in decent numbers, the Germans the Wehrmacht had no tanks, not a single tank that could take it on. Now, because the German tank crews were so expert and well trained, they could do workarounds like shoot shells at the rim of the rotating rim of the tank so that the ball bearings would seize. But you had to be really good. That was a pinpoint shot. Or shoot out the tracks of the tank, or shoot out the elevation mechanism of the gun, of the main gun, so that it couldn't be aimed. They could do things like that. And the German tank crews were good enough where they could do that, or many of them. Their gunners were that capable. And by contrast, the Soviet tank crews were very poorly trained. Nonetheless, the point was that if all the Panzer IIIs, or most of them, had been upgunned to the 50mm, that means they could have knocked out any T-34 that came around. But the only equipment that could knock out a T-34 tank was the 88mm field guns, of which they didn't have very many at the time in the East. And so there was much confusion in knocking out the Soviet tanks. It was very difficult to knock them out unless you had an 88mm on hand, and those were in short supply initially. So again, had the Panzer III, as Hitler wanted, been upgunned, I think the war could have turned out very differently. Now, also, if you look at the other intelligence, or focusing on the intelligence there, and the intelligence around the T-34, they were aware of it, but thought that it was a long way off, where in reality, prototypes were already being used. Wehrmacht intelligence had also underestimated the amount of war materiel available to Soviet forces. Artillery pieces, for example, they had nearly double the amount of artillery pieces that the Wehrmacht thought. Now we need to just look at this. The Wehrmacht intelligence were looking at the quality of manufacture as well as the amount of pieces. So they were looking at, there are 10,000 artillery pieces, but many of these are so badly made and in such a poor state of repair that they can't be deployed, that they don't exist in any battlefield-ready reality. So we're going to say that there are only 5,000 pieces. Now, in the event, it turns out that there were more serviceable pieces of artillery than the Wehrmacht intelligence thought there was. Was that a big deal in itself? Probably not. But it was nonetheless an issue that had to be dealt with. This idea that a lot of the equipment, such as tanks, artillery and aircraft, wouldn't be ready or wouldn't be available to be used, wasn't actually that far off the mark. It was give or take, it was a reasonable assessment. Now, there's a common myth, I guess, about Soviet tanks at the time, that many of them had a 45mm main gun or cannon, and that was more than enough to knock out any of the German tanks. And so this quote that's supposed to be from some Soviet officer that it was only good for shooting sparrows is bullshit, absolute bullshit. 45mm was, the 35 to 37mm was considered to be the standard for anti-tank guns, or anti-tank knockout sort of guns. And many Soviet, not all, but many Soviet tanks had 45mm guns or greater. The T-34 had a 76mm cannon or main gun, which again was more than enough to knock out any of the Wehrmacht tanks at the time. So this 45mm gun, again, could knock out any of the panzers in the field. Now, the Red Army in total had about 20,000 tanks, depending on whose numbers you look at. Many of these were in a poor state of repair, and because the Soviet armed forces were so badly organised and training was so piss poor, they often were going to battle with the ones that were serviceable, that is, and many of them weren't. More than half weren't really operational. But some were operational, the motors were operational, but the guns weren't. The cannon was okay, but the firing pin didn't work. So there were a lot of problems in maintenance standards and serviceability standards here. But on top of that, they would often go into battle with incorrect ordnance. So they'd have shells in the cabin of the tank that weren't the right shells for the main gun that the tank had. The crews were very poorly trained. Very few of the tanks had radios, so if they got into battle and were looking for instructions, then they couldn't get them. So they had to stick their head out of the turret and use flags and hand signals, which is when there's smoke everywhere and bullets flying left, right and centre. It's not something you really want to do. Others would have the wrong fuel, or these tanks would run on diesel, but there was only non-diesel fuels there, or they ran on petroleum, but they only had diesel. And the mistakes and the logistical errors and just poor organisation was rampant. So in the end, somewhere in the region, even though there's 20,000 tanks in theoretical existence, only about 7,000 tanks, again on whose numbers you look at, only about 7,000 Soviet tanks actually saw battle. And all of these were knocked out within the first several weeks of the war. Now, Wehrmacht intelligence also underestimated a number of other things, but this was viewed as not a big deal. They had underestimated the capacity of Soviet factories to pack up and relocate to the other side of the Ural Mountains, which are to the east of Moscow. And also they'd underestimated the ability of the Soviets to build new electricity generation plants, to find, rebuild the factories and set them up, even if the factories were on dirt floors, which many of them were, or to find other mines in order to extract natural, raw materials such as coal and iron ore and the like. Now, these factories may have been horrendously inefficient, very, very low level efficiency in terms of extraction. The quality of the iron ore may have been substandard, which it mostly was. But the coal was extracted at great expense. The electricity generation was always breaking down. But they were running three shifts to produce war material. So within 12 months, the Soviets, even in spite of all the area that was conquered by the Wehrmacht, they were still able to replace their war material production, and even to outproduce the German war machine. So this is, no matter how you look at it, this is an incredible achievement. And if you want to look at point to sort of astonishing achievements in resetting up, relocating that much industry and turning out war material on that scale, this has got to be one of the most stunning achievements of any modern industrial war. Now, again, just coming back to this relocation and the ability of the Soviets to pack up factories, in the event the Wehrmacht captured many thousands of machine tools and metal presses and all sorts of industrial equipment. So the Soviets not only had to relocate whatever they could pack up and move, but also had to replace many of those machine tools. Now, the quality of the goods, the war material they produced was not very good, and the Wehrmacht planners and intelligence considered this, that whatever the Soviets would produce would be of low quality, and this would impact their fighting capacity. And this was true, by the way, but the volume of production was so great in the end that the Soviets could afford 50% breakdown rates and still have more equipment in the field than the Wehrmacht did. So the idea of the mass manufacturing and effectively swarming and swamping the battlefield with equipment, much of it unusable or needing additional maintenance and repair, nonetheless, such was the scale of it that it still outpaced German production. So given the planning and the contingencies and so on, why did the world's most capable military planners misjudge the situation, and what factors were they misjudging? I guess working down from the higher level causes of planning and consideration, it's not simply that the planning was off, and it's also a matter of execution as well within the planning that needs to be looked at. Now, something that I think is critically important and been mentioned, but I don't think it's highlighted enough, is that something called the force to space ratio. Now, this is in battlefield terms. It's how much military force that you can apply on a given battlefront, whether that be wide or narrow, but how much concentrated force you can apply, and how decisive that application of force is over the depth of the battlefield. So, if say your objective, as it was here, is to destroy the frontier armies, what you're wanting to do is attack a narrow battlefront with overwhelming force, which the Blitzkrieg was very good at, overwhelming force, and then you've got mobile columns going into the rear areas of the front enemy battle lines, spreading havoc and mayhem, shooting out radio towers, disrupting supply lines, capturing fuel and ammunition dumps, capturing key bridges and roads and so on, shooting up any aircraft and air landing strips, bombing the bejabbers out of them, and so you what you can't take control of, you've spread absolute mayhem on. Now, when you're especially if you're a Soviet commander and you're in the front line, and many Soviet officers get killed for showing any initiative, so they're very reluctant to do anything unless they're instructed to do it. Once they're instructed, it's someone else's problem, not theirs. So they're very much not the frontline officers were not prepared to make decisions. So you've lost communication, and the Blitzkrieg, you've now lost all communication. The reinforcements or the ammunition dumps and fuel dumps that you thought you had access to are now cut off from you. You can't fight for much more than another hour or two. You'll run out of ammunition. Well, what do? You call for instructions. Tell me what to do. You can't get any instructions. The enemy's getting close all the time. You don't even know where the enemy is in the rear areas. They're moving at the rate of several kilometres an hour, even if they're having to fight along the way. So, and the Panzers really aren't going much more than 20 kilometres an hour, even when they're going cross country. And remember, they've got to stay in some sort of formation, reconnaissance units out front. And Wehrmacht reconnaissance units are expert, the most expert in the world by far. So they're out there spreading mayhem and so on. And so your option is to fight it out with hardly any ammunition left, or to surrender, which many of them did. So this force-to-space ratio, and if we look at the force-to-space ratio as it was, say, in Poland, or particularly France, which is a stunning success there, you strike with maximum force on a narrow front, and then spread out or fan out across the rear areas until you've taken sufficient tactical or strategic control of the battlefield, or seized key assets, or both. In the case of France, that they achieved tactical, strategic, unquestioned superiority. Then the main asset, for example, Paris, could then be taken somewhat at leisure. Now, in the case of the Soviet Union, it's a little bit different, because in France you've only got a few hundred kilometres to go before you've seized, you achieve tactical, strategic supremacy, and you've seized the key assets. In the Soviet Union, it's different. You've got 850 something kilometres to go in the centre line before you've seized the key assets, Moscow. You've got over 1,000 kilometres to go before you've seized the key assets in the south. Close to 1,500 kilometres really to seize the oil fields and Crimea and all that around there. So that's a major undertaking. And then you've got the several hundred kilometres going up to Leningrad, modern day St. Petersburg in the north. So there's three separate war theatres: Army Group North, Army Group Centre, Army Group South. So the force to space ratio equation is now very different from what it was. And I don't know how well appreciated that was by planners at the time. Given that the concentration was on, well, as long as we destroy the frontier armies, it's pretty much done and dusted at that point. But the reality was that you had an 850 kilometre sort of east-west depth to get to Moscow along the main line. But as for every 100 kilometres you advance towards Moscow, the battlefront would expand in a north-south terms by another 100 kilometres. This means to cover the battle line, cover the front, the battlefront, requires a vast dispersion of resources. Not that it wasn't possible to concentrate striking power, it was, but not to the extent necessary to win the quick, decisive victories, particularly after the frontier battles, which were successful, by the way. But once those frontier battles were done, the dispersal of striking power was such that it was much more difficult to achieve those decisive battles in the time frame needed to. Remember, the Wehrmacht has to. After the frontier battles, the Soviets are mobilising troops to the tune of 800,000 to 1 million fresh soldiers a month. Now, this is more than double what the Wehrmacht planners thought would happen, and this is another key issue. The Red Army was able to mobilise far more quickly than was imagined. But this force-to-space ratio comes back into consideration, I think, all along. That is, the Blitzkrieg depended on maximum force-to-space application, and over a wider battlefront with multiple objectives, that was diluted. That striking power was dispersed, and I think this was a decisive consideration in the inability of the Wehrmacht to wrap it all up before October. Now, the Soviet ability to mobilise and arm troops at more than double the rate the planners expected was also a huge issue. I mean, we need to remember here that the Soviets, within 5 months, 5.5 months, had, including the frontier armies, had put over 9 million troops into the battle. 9 million, for goodness sakes. Now, the Wehrmacht planners thought at the very outside, after the frontier armies had been destroyed, at the very outside they'd maybe get another 2 million, and they'd be sort of all over the place and not concentrated in any decisive sort of battle formation. So this was, again, more than double. Now, there's some arguments over to what extent these soldiers were hastily assembled militia and sort of here's a rifle, go into battle or something, or whether they were trained. The training was quite poor. Not many soldiers were trained. Most of the trained soldiers were killed in the battle or captured in the battle, in the frontier battles. And some of these troops had 1 or 2 weeks training. They were required to sort of crawl along the ground while shells were being exploded and bullets were whizzing over their heads, simply to give them acclimatise them to the noises and smells and whatnot of the battlefield. And that was it. And then they were sent into battle. So these were hardly well trained troops, and they were sent in large numbers. The other thing that the Wehrmacht planners misunderstood or underestimated was the mass, when the Soviets went to war economy, the mass mobilisation of women and young people to work in the factories. This is something Hitler would never countenance for the German young people and for German women. And of course, mentioned before, the Soviet preparedness to sustain mass casualties. So let's consider these things in turn. Again, we need to just accept that the Soviet frontier armies, 3.2 million were destroyed very successfully and 100% to plan. So the Wehrmacht planning is actually going, pretty much clockwork. But what happens thereafter is the ability of the Soviets to mass mobilise. Political collapse did not occur. It wasn't being relied upon, but it was thought to be so. The next sort of step was what did the Wehrmacht do? There was some confusion. What do we do if there's no political collapse after we've destroyed the frontier armies, which again was done very successfully into plan. After we've destroyed the Soviet frontier armies, there's no political collapse. And as we're now finding out, the Soviets are mobilising troops at a much faster rate than we'd anticipated. So what do we do? And at this point, confusion seemed to set in, and it was often referred to as the interregnum. But another factor, I guess, with mobilisation, Soviet mobilisation tended to be local, geographical, and as they didn't have the means to quickly transport and concentrate the troops in every situation, so they didn't have that means. That meant that mobilised units were all across the now 1,100 kilometre wide battlefront, and as much as they may not have been decisive in winning battles or they still had to be dealt with, which meant Wehrmacht troops had to be dispersed over that whole area, even if it was just to contain possible problems with a local unit, locally mobilised Red Army units. And this again comes back to the dispersal of striking power. Now, what would be the objectives? The objectives had been Leningrad, say Crimea, Rostov in the south, and Moscow in the centre. And there was now arguments about what should now be. Remember, the Wehrmacht is in Smolensk. They're on the outskirts of Leningrad. They're approaching, the Crimea in the south. So what's to be in Kiev? What's to be the objectives now? Now at this point, Hitler intervenes and says, look, a drive on Moscow would be high risk, which is something he's always considered. So let's clear away the flanks. There's 600,000 Soviet troops around Kiev. Let's deal with that. Let's clear those away. We want to capture at least the downtown area of Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and capture that naval base, Kronstadt naval base. We need to capture that, which will then give us complete control of the Baltic Sea, which will take pressure off the Finns, who are also assisting the Wehrmacht at this point, and will free up some logistical options to move supplies into Leningrad and access the rail network there to deliver supplies to the front lines. So the decision is made to go after Leningrad and to go and try and capture at least the downtown area of Leningrad and neutralise the naval base, and to remove the 600,000 Soviet forces in Kiev, in Ukraine. So instead of driving on Moscow, they decide to do this. But this only happens after a number of weeks of bickering. And bear in mind that they didn't, the Wehrmacht planners at this stage thought the war was pretty much won, and therefore they didn't approach this next step with a sense of urgency that you'd think they would. And there's almost a leisurely pace here. You could call it overconfidence or whatever, but it seems quite leisurely. Generals like Guderian, the Panzer General, says we need to go for Moscow. The generals on the ground were really preferring Moscow. If we can knock out that rail hub, because that's the central Russian rail hub, if we can knock out that rail hub, then we can prevent the Soviets from moving troops around using the rail network. They don't have many trucks, so we can effectively immobilise the troop distribution aspect of the war machine if we capture Moscow. So the generals on the ground were very much of that view. The planners back in Berlin took a bigger, a wider strategic view of things, as indeed did Hitler. So they decided to go for Leningrad and Kiev. Now this had an effect of slowing down the attack on Moscow by several weeks. Now the attack on the capturing of the Soviet troops around Kiev was very successful. They bagged something like 600,000 Soviet troops there, many surrendering. The Leningrad thing, they were just too late by the time they got there, and they had to divert tanks from Army Group Centre, panzers, to go to Leningrad. But by the time they got that attack underway, all the anti-tank ditches, and there were some very formidable defences there that in the end, given the amount of force and time they had, they couldn't overcome. So they achieved nothing in Leningrad. And then all those tanks, now many having needed a lot of maintenance, were now brought back to Army Group Centre for the attack on Moscow. So the attack on Moscow began later, and as we know, the rainy season began and so on. So these considerations, or these sort of delays and these planning uncertainty certainly played into the non-success of the invasion in the end. And we'll come to the invasion again in the next episode here. Now, also, I guess looking at the casualties here. The Soviet troop casualties were militia people and minimally trained soldiers. So when you look at the Wehrmacht lost 50,000 soldiers, but 500,000 soldiers were killed or captured. The Soviets the Red Army was losing soldiers that were trained, most of them trained to a very minimal level, whereas the Wehrmacht soldiers, by contrast, were very highly trained, certainly relative to the Red Army soldiers. So when you lose a highly trained soldier, it takes 6 months plus to replace them, where if you lose a minimally trained soldier, you can replace them in a week. And this was one of the differences, that the casualties the Wehrmacht suffered were loss of highly trained, skilled personnel, whereas the loss that the Red Army was suffering was just another citizen, and the Soviet ideological government didn't give a fuck. So now I think this just about sums up the status here, and so the conclusion on this is that the planning to invade and the considerations to invade the Soviet Union were all valid, and the goals that were set for the initial phase of that invasion were well thought out, well considered, well planned, logistically well supported, and there was nothing you could point to say that there was a deeply flawed plan or consideration. Really, it came down to one thing in particular, I think, which is the Soviets were able to mobilise soldiers far more quickly than the Wehrmacht had imagined, and in intelligence terms at least, there was more usable equipment in the field, and again, Wehrmacht planners are considered. All this was overcome in the frontier battles, but as it went beyond the frontier battles, and millions of troops were being poured into the front line by the Red Army, for this, the Wehrmacht was not adequately prepared. And that's, I think, the basis for the seeds for what was ultimately an unsuccessful invasion. Look out for the part 3 of this series, which will be the actual war in Russia, and I'll be interested in seeing your comments below. You've been with Tassus today, and thank you for joining and having a look at this video.